Ever heard of the Battle of Waterloo? Of course you have. It's the battle that ended Napoleon Bonaparte's career for good. But what if I told you there was another battle, a much larger and bloodier one, fought 18 months earlier, that truly sealed his fate? A battle so massive it was known as the Battle of the Nations. This was the Battle of Leipzig, Napoleon's first decisive defeat on the battlefield, and the beginning of the end of his empire. Today we're diving deep into this colossal clash that reshaped the map of Europe. So how did we get here? Let's rewind to 1812. Napoleon, master of most of Europe, makes a catastrophic mistake. He invades Russia. His Grande Armée, once the most powerful military force on the continent, is shattered by the brutal Russian winter and relentless partisan attacks. Of the more than 600,000 men who marched into Russia, fewer than 100,000 stumbled back out. This disastrous campaign broke the myth of Napoleon's invincibility. It was a signal to the rest of Europe, a continent groaning under French domination, that the time to strike back had come. Seizing the opportunity, a new coalition formed against France. This wasn't the first coalition, or the second, or even the fifth. This was the sixth coalition, a grand alliance led by Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. Britain, as always, was bankrolling the whole operation from across the Channel, their navy controlling the seas. These nations were tired of French rule, tired of conscription, and tired of the constant warfare that had plagued Europe for 2 decades. They saw a wounded Napoleon and decided to go for the kill. But Napoleon was not a man to be underestimated, even in defeat. He was a whirlwind of energy. Rushing back to Paris, he performed a political and military miracle. He raised a new army, largely composed of young, inexperienced conscripts teenagers who were nicknamed Marie-Louises after the Empress. Despite their youth, their loyalty to the Emperor was fierce. Within a few months, he had conjured up an army of nearly 400,000 men. It was an astonishing feat of mobilization. He was ready for one more roll of the dice. The stage for this epic confrontation was set in the German states, specifically Saxony. In the spring and summer of 1813, a series of brutal but indecisive battles were fought. Napoleon won several victories, like at Lutzen and Botzen, but they weren't the crushing, war-ending triumphs of his earlier years. A key problem was his lack of experienced cavalry, which had been almost completely wiped out in Russia. Without cavalry, he couldn't effectively pursue and destroy a retreating enemy. So, the coalition armies could disengage, regroup, and fight another day. The Allies, meanwhile, had learned from their past mistakes. They adopted a new strategy, known as the Trachenberg Plan. It was simple but brilliant. Avoid direct battle with Napoleon himself. Instead, they would target his marshals. Whenever Napoleon moved, the Allied army he was facing would retreat, while other Allied armies would advance and attack his subordinates elsewhere. This plan would slowly bleed Napoleon's forces, stretch his lines of communication, and prevent him from landing a decisive knockout blow. It was a war of attrition, and with the combined manpower of half of Europe, it was a war the Allies were bound to win. As autumn approached, both sides began to converge on the Saxon city of Leipzig. Why Leipzig? It was a major hub of roads, a strategic crossroads in the heart of Germany. Controlling Leipzig meant controlling movement and supply lines throughout the region. Napoleon hoped to use the city as a central base to defeat the Allied armies one by one as they approached. The Allies, following their plan, aimed to encircle him there, using their superior numbers to crush him in a single, massive engagement. The board was set for the largest battle in European history up to that point. On the eve of battle, the numbers were staggering. Napoleon commanded around 190,000 soldiers. The coalition, however, had him massively outnumbered. They brought a combined force of over 360,000 men, with more reinforcements on the way. These armies weren't just from a few nations. They were a true melting pot of Europe. Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes, all united by a common goal: the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. The city of Leipzig and the surrounding plains, rivers, and villages were about to become a gigantic killing field. The battle began on October 16, 1813. It was a foggy, grim morning. The fighting erupted south of the city, where Napoleon launched a major assault. Hoping to break the main Allied army under the Austrian Prince Schwarzenberg before the other coalition forces could arrive. For a moment, it looked like the old Napoleonic magic was working. French columns smashed into the Allied lines, and a massive cavalry charge led by Marshal Murat, the flamboyant king of Naples, nearly broke through to the Allied headquarters. The Allied monarchs, the Tsar of Russia, the King of Prussia, and the Emperor of Austria, who were observing the battle from a nearby hill, were nearly captured. It was a heart-stopping moment, but the Allies held. Their lines bent, but they did not break. Russian and Prussian guards were thrown into the fray at the critical moment, stabilizing the front. The sheer number of Allied soldiers meant they could plug any gap and absorb the French attacks. All day, the battle raged across a 20-mile front with unimaginable ferocity. Villages were taken and retaken multiple times, often at bayonet point. By the end of the first day, tens of thousands had fallen, but neither side had gained a decisive advantage. It was a bloody stalemate, but for Napoleon, a stalemate was as good as a loss. Needed a quick victory, and he hadn't gotten it. His window of opportunity was closing. The second day, October 17th, was strangely quiet on the main fronts. Both sides were exhausted and spent the day licking their wounds, reorganizing their units, and bringing up reinforcements. This pause was a disaster for Napoleon. While he received a few thousand fresh troops, the Allies were massively reinforced. The armies of the Swedish Crown Prince Bernadotte, a former marshal of Napoleon's, and the Russian General Bennigsen arrived, swelling the coalition numbers to nearly 400,000. The iron ring around Leipzig was tightening. Napoleon was now hopelessly outnumbered and almost completely surrounded. He tried to open negotiations, but the Allies, sensing victory, ignored his offer. They wanted total surrender. October 18th marked the main and most brutal day of the battle. The Allies launched a massive, coordinated assault from all sides. Over 500,000 men were now locked in a death struggle. The sound of over 2,000 cannons firing was deafening, a constant, earth-shaking roar that could be heard for miles. The scale of the fighting was immense. The south, the French desperately held on to villages like Probstede, which became a charnel house. In the north, the fighting was just as savage. Then came the moment that symbolized the collapse of Napoleon's German allies. During the height of the battle, an entire Saxon division, who had been fighting alongside the French, suddenly switched sides. They turned their guns on their former comrades and marched over to the Allied lines. This defection was a devastating blow to French morale and created a huge gap in their defenses. It was a sign that Napoleon's grip on Europe was not just breaking, it was shattering. The liberation of Germany was happening right there on the battlefield. By the evening of the 18th, the French position was untenable. They had fought with incredible courage, but they were exhausted, running out of ammunition, and overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Napoleon had no choice but to order a retreat. The only escape route was a single bridge, the Lindenau Bridge, over the Elster River to the west. What followed was a scene of chaos and horror. The entire French army, along with its artillery, wagons, and wounded, tried to squeeze through this one narrow bottleneck. The retreat on October 19th turned into a disaster. The Allied armies pressed in, pouring fire into the panicked crowds trying to cross the bridge. Then, the unthinkable happened. A nervous French corporal, tasked with blowing up the bridge to prevent the Allies from pursuing, lit the fuse too early. The bridge exploded while thousands of French soldiers were still on the eastern side, including the rear guard. Their escape route was gone. Trapped between the river and the advancing enemy, thousands surrendered. Many others, including the heroic Polish Prince and Marshal of France Poniatowski, drowned, trying to swim across the river. It was a catastrophic end to a catastrophic battle. The aftermath was grim. The Battle of Leipzig was the bloodiest battle of the Napoleonic Wars. Over 4 days, an estimated 100,000 men were killed or wounded. The city of Leipzig was overwhelmed with the dead and dying. The French army had been utterly broken. Napoleon managed to escape with the remnants of his forces, but his empire in Germany was gone. The Confederation of the Rhine, his alliance of German states, collapsed. Holland and Spain were soon lost as well. The Allied armies pursued him relentlessly, crossing the Rhine and invading France itself for the first time in a generation. Leipzig wasn't the final battle, but it was the decisive one. It proved that Napoleon could be beaten in a major set-piece battle. It showed that the nations of Europe, when united, were more powerful than even the greatest military genius of the age. 6 months later, the Allies would march into Paris, and Napoleon would be forced to abdicate and exiled to the island of Elba. Of course, he would return for one last gamble at Waterloo, but it was here, in the muddy fields around Leipzig, that the Napoleonic dream truly died. The Battle of the Nations had lived up to its name, and a new era for Europe had begun. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into military history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments what other historical battles you'd like to see covered. See you in the next one.